for the invitation and thank you very much for the introduction. I suggest that I can talk for 3 days if you want, but I suggest that I will break up my presentation at certain points and allow you to ask questions, clarification or criticism, whatever you want. There is a risk that we then end up discussing things that bring us away from what that's not a problem to me. Then a question for the host, keep an eye on the watch there. So I was asked to say a word or two on recent trends, or the Synoptic Problem, recent trends. That's how it is announced, and I was asked to do this. So what you see there on the screen is something that I will use for my talk this afternoon. It was not devised for the talk. It's much broader than but I will pick out certain sides from this to make a point that I want to make. Where to begin? Maybe just by first trying to give a definition of synoptic problem. The term can be understood in a couple of ways, but the way I understand it, and most people in the business, is that we deal with a problem that in a sense we have created ourselves on the basis of certain phenomena that we see when we read 3 of the 4 Gospels, that means the 3 Gospels apart from John, who seem to have a lot in common and then also a lot that differs amongst them. Now you can take different positions towards that. You can just ignore this. You can go for an easy solution and just say, well, it's all oral tradition, and these 3 Gospels, well, they look the same. They are maybe in part complete agreement with each other, and in part they differ, but it's all the play of oral tradition that just provides this and then results in what we see in our Gospels. Or you can take a different approach and try to explain the agreements, but then also the differences in a framework of literary dependence, so that at least 2, maybe all 3 of these Gospels are somehow related to each other in terms of a literary dependence. Now, this is a lot that has been said, and nothing has been said, because we can go on then. What's a literary dependence? There's different ways to be literary dependent on a source. When you copy a source, you are literally depending on the source. Then you just copy it verbatim. You do a mixture of copying and, let's say, paraphrasing. That's also literary dependence. But is it also literary dependence when you show in your text that you must have seen or read or know another text, even if there is very little literary agreement, verbatim agreement between your text and this other text? That is part of the problem. A way to solve it is to say that with the Synoptic Problem, we focus on 3 Gospels that have much more in common than John has with any of these 3. You can also talk about literary dependence between John and the 3 Synoptic Gospels, Mark, Matthew, and Luke, but it's a different kind of literary dependence there. And most people will say, John does not belong to the Synoptic Problem. It is a related problem in a sense, but with very different conditions, with very different presuppositions behind it. So that John has a link, a literary link maybe, to any of the 3 or to all 3 of the Synoptic Gospels is left out of the discussion here. So it's a Synoptic Problem in this strict way. 3 Gospels that have quite a lot in common apparently, but also quite a lot that differs amongst them. That's one thing. The second part of the title, Recent Trends. Trends that may sound like, yeah, it's something that is in these days. It's the trend to eat this or that or so. That's in part what it is, but it's going to be more than that. I take trend in the sense it is something that is discussed, debated, and you have to take trend not in this other meaning of, yeah, today it's on the table and tomorrow it's gone. It's just the opposite, actually. The synoptic problem is, but cannot be solved, to put it bluntly. It's a problem that will be there for eternity, I'm afraid. Now, this may scare you away, or you could say, well, why create a problem and then you can't solve it? I think this is what happens in all disciplines, in all academic disciplines. We all have, in whatever discipline you can give me, I can give you an example of a problem that cannot be solved. Either because we miss the necessary documentation to do so, and then we can also hope that maybe one day we dig up something in Egypt and that gives us the proofs that we want. Okay, good for you if you dream. Or the problem is insolvable because we work with certain presuppositions about the problem, and you have others than I have, so we will go on discussion forever. We will never agree because I'm not prepared to give up my propositions, you're not prepared to let your propositions go down. That makes it also insolvable in a sense and eternal. To give you just one example for both cases, in classic studies, they have the so-called Homeric question. You may have heard of that, the Homeric question. Who wrote the Iliad and Odyssey? Is it one author? Is it a bunch of authors that we don't know about? What's the status of this so-called Homer? Was he one of these many, or was he kind of the redactor who put everything together? This is a discussion that has been going on since the old Greeks, and that is not solved today. You have 10 different opinions on that, and they are there since 3,000 years almost. This will not be solved unless we find a papyrus where Homer says, I wrote this whole thing myself. And then probably some people will say this is false, it's not an authentic document. So this is one of the things. We don't have the material to solve the question. The other thing that we have presuppositions, take for instance in psychology. A lot of what you do in treating psychological problems has to do with the way you have a global view on what a person is, or what a human being is. If you think that a human being is a very complex thing, that with a lot of factors in it that you can't get grip on, you will probably treat that person, that individual, differently from someone who has a more mechanistic view, if you want, and say, well, a person there's a bit of chemicalia in it, and that is it. And with the right treatment, I can make sure that these things are normalized in one way or another. It's the famous debate in the 60s between Skinner and the rest of the world. You had people who said, I have a problem, a psychological problem. I'll go in psychoanalysis for 15 years and maybe then they will give me a solution to my problem. And Skinner said, give me 10 minutes and 20 electroshocks and your problem is gone. So they have never met, these two. They will never meet. It's a completely different mindset, a completely different presupposition of the subject that you are working on. Just to say, this is also very much the case in how you look at these relations or at the phenomena in these three Gospels and the relations that they may or may not have. On the first thing, I also mention fact and fiction and fact and interpretation. We are talking about interpretation above all. Whether there are facts behind what is said in the Gospels is a different matter, in a sense, to solve the problem of the relations between, or the assumed relation between the Gospels. It's an interpretation on historical level, an interpretation on an exegetical or on a theological level. It's the element of creativity of the researcher, sorry for the mistake there, of the researcher that plays a role in this. And it is very much a question of discussing theories, or better, I would say, hypotheses. And that's quite important also with regard to the current trends I will be talking about in a moment. If there's one important move that has been made, I would say, in the last 40 years, it's that we have, in studying the synoptic problem, we have given up on certainty and truth claims, and we work with plausibilities. We look for plausibility. This has always been the case, only former generations tended to talk, especially our German colleagues have this, it's the nature of the language, they can formulate it just in such a way that it looks like this is the absolute truth. It's said like that, it's pronounced like that, geworden sein, so that it must be like that. You cannot change it anymore. We have gone away from that. And we talk about plausibilities, which also means there is a shift from theory, which I define as something that everyone accepts and agrees on, to hypothesis. And I can defend my hypothesis, and everyone can defend his hypothesis, but it is different. The talk is different, the discourse is different, the attitude will be different. Yeah? It's quite important to realize that, and it's an important change that has been made. Linked to that and influenced, the move has been influenced by people like, above all, Karl Popper. I mentioned a couple of books there, but it's especially his second book and also a bit in his first book, that he develops this motif, or this concept of falsifiability. And a hypothesis is only scientific when you can bring in arguments against it. Yeah? If you can't do that, then you don't have a scientific hypothesis, according to the definition of Popper. That's quite important. A long time people have just ignored that, actually, have not reflected on it. With Popper, we have started reflecting on this. So an hypothesis is something that is open for attacks, and it's on the defenders of the hypothesis to counter these attacks, to find better arguments for their hypothesis, to nuance their hypothesis maybe, or to counterattack and say, well, yeah, but your argument does not bring anything to your own hypothesis. So you have a way of discussing there that is quite different from the idea that we had in the 19th century still, I have the truth and I'll tell you the truth. Linked to that as well is another revolution, in a sense, is which was developed by Thomas Kuhn in the Structure of Scientific Revolutions. And science is something in which progress should be made, and progress is made basically, according to Kuhn, by changes in axiomas, changes in your presuppositions, in what you always took as evident. As long as you stay within your own presuppositions, you will not make any progress, according to Kuhn. I think he's a bit too strong there, but he has something there. With opening up to a different kind of approach, that progress is made. Now this, as I say, I agree and I partly disagree with that. We have opened up in the synoptic studies quite a lot to other axiomas, to other presuppositions, to hear other voices. This has brought progress, depending on how you define progress. Some will say it brought chaos now, because everyone says everything now. Maybe that is what progress is, that we don't know what it is, but everyone has his right or her right to say what he or she thinks is a valuable argument or a valuable approach to the problem. And then we have a lot to discuss on the table. The last thing on origins. It's about the synoptic problem. It's about the relations between Gospels. These relations point to something that was before that. How did this come together? How did these three originate? And so you talk about origins in an absolute form, what was there before any of the other Gospels was written, or in a relative form, what was there when a later Gospel was written. Was there another Gospel before? Was there other evidence before that may have played a role in the composition of a certain text? So there are several levels and several types of origin, if you want. And that is quite important as well. Now, when I say recent trends, I take this a bit broader than the word recent usually is used, and for two reasons actually. I'm very much convinced that talking about recent trends in synoptic studies, but also in other fields, can only be done when you have a good knowledge of what preceded today. So you have to have a good knowledge of the past, just in order not to repeat the stupidities that were said in the past, or to be aware and try to avoid them by coming up with better arguments, but also because what we see today as recent trends, they all have a history, except for one. They all have a history in a more or less distant past. And that's not just for synoptic studies, that's in other fields as well. So what we see as recent trends are not so-called, not so much new things as revivals of old things. Now, in the whole of the history of the church and in the history of biblical studies, the synoptic problem, as defined in terms of literary relations between three of the four Gospels, is a fairly recent phenomenon. For almost 18 centuries, intellectuals, theologians didn't care about it. No one really made an effort to explain at a certain scientific level the phenomenon that strikes me and strikes others about these relations. We have some evidence from the past, and I mentioned them, but I will not go into that. This was the way to do it, I think. This is the pre-critical period. I will not go through this. There's a number of names there, all to prove that they know nothing about it and did not make any effort to make sense of the problem. They just kept themselves to the level of general statements. Mark followed Matthew. Augustine's famous Mark abbreviated Matthew. Yeah, my grandma can see that Mark is shorter than Matthew, so maybe he abbreviated it, or maybe it was the other way around. He doesn't care. He just works with the canon as he has it. There is a one gospel first, and that's the oldest then, just take it for granted. There's another one that is shorter, so we must abbreviate them. And there's a third one who seems to have links to the others, so we used it to others. How and why, that's not even addressed by Augustine, just to mention him. And that's the same with others. These old theologians, and old means up to the 17th and early 18th century, they had their own way to look at it. It's not so much the differences that count, it's what the agreements count. And the agreements can be strengthened in several ways. For instance, as Irenaeus already did in the 2nd century, by saying, well, okay, there's four Gospels, but they all say the same. Well, not exactly the same, he says, but they are expressions of the one Gospel. And there's this notion that in modern literature was coined for that. This is the fourfold Gospels. There's four of them, but they say the same, basically. And the difference don't matter that much, actually. Yeah? That's one way to approach the whole thing, in general. Another way, which has been very, very influential, up to the 17th century, is by making the four look like one. You just put the four together into one text. Yeah? And you can do that in different ways. and you create gospel harmonies. There's hundreds of these gospel harmonies, more literal, more strict and less strict, whatever you want. But it's the same attitude. It's all the same, you know, and you can put them on one text. It's the same attitude actually. So the differences don't count. It's what agrees with, where they agree with each other that counts. So we have to wait the late 18th century to see things change and to see the start of what I call, and others call, a critical study of the Gospels. It starts in our field with someone, Herman Samuel Reimarus, who has written a text that he did not dare to publish in his own days because it was so revolutionary. He had to wait for someone 10 years after his death, for Lessing, who published one part of this text, and it took another 200 years before this manuscript of Reimarus was published, in which he frontally attacks anything that looks like a gospel harmony. This is just obscuring the truth, he said. The Gospels are very different. And it's the differences that are important. The agreements, they count for something, but they are actually less interesting. It's where the differences are that you can see authors at work with different agendas, with different purposes, with different ideas about the same topic. Yeah? So Reimarus did something there, or gave a start to it, but then gave up on it. These fragments of his text are called the Wolfen-Butler fragment, that doesn't matter. Lessing took up this, published a part of that, and that's the real start, in a sense, of a critical study of the Gospel. Now, Reimarus' text, it's not just in German, it's written in an impossible German, so don't try to read it. It's phrases like that, and in the end, you have to reread the phrase 5 times to see where is the main verb in the phrase, and it's really difficult to read. What also played a role that is often obscure, that's a whole generation of English deists. So people theologians who did not believe in a personal God. There is something divine principle, and they had a more open mind to the Gospels. And they also saw the differences and the importance of the differences. But they are predecessors in a sense because they never put anything really paper and never really. What was really important with Reimarus, and that he has explained in published material, and that is, what does biblical exegesis do? What's the purpose of biblical exegesis and biblical studies? Up to then, it was to support, develop, especially support doctrine. So it's biblical studies serves systematic theology. They have to bring in the material, the ammunition, to defend positions in doctrine. Reimarus make an absolute cut there, a radical cut. Biblical studies has its own purpose. It studies the basic sources on which doctrine is made, but it studies these sources for themselves. And whatever our friends, systematic theologians, do with it, it's not my business, Reimarus says. That's not my field. That's something else. What I can do is tell the colleagues that they are wrong when they do this and this with biblical text, because that is not what the biblical text tells me. And I read the biblical text for itself and analyzes it for itself. This is radical. You really have to realize that. Which also made biblical studies move from serving dogmatics and doctrine to a science or a scientific field in itself. I study these Gospels, and whatever comes from it for dogmatics, that's not my business. Yeah? This was revolutionary. This has, of course, enormous consequences. And one of the consequences that we see today is that we may still live on the same floor, biblical scholars and systematic theologians, but we live in different worlds quite often. They don't read us, and we don't read them anymore. That's a different thing. I can give you a talk on that as well. But that's actually, in a part, a direct consequence of a move that was made there. This is the late 18th. We go a bit further, late 18th and early 20th century, early 19th century, and I called it just a moment ago the crucial 19th century. So it starts in the 1780s, if you want, but it comes to full blow in the 19th century. First of all, with a hypothesis that was first presented by the same Lessing. If these Gospels look so much the same, but yet are different, we have only one possible option, he says, and that is we have to put somewhere an original Gospel from which all the other Gospels are derived. That's what he does. He does a bit more. He gives still a place to oral tradition. There was oral tradition. We don't know what was in it. We don't know how much of what was there has been taken over in the Gospels, but there is something there, oral tradition. There was a Gospel which he calls the Ur-Evangelium, a Ur-Gospel in Aramaic, and in Lessing's position, in 3 different forms, so variable forms. It took 3 different forms, and they ended up in the 3 Gospels that we have. All 3 depend on oral tradition, but all 3 depend on a variant form of a more or less similar Ur-Gospel. Now this is brilliant, of course, this is brilliant. Yeah? It explains everything in a very simple way. Already there is a problem it has to do with variable, yeah? And this was picked up by a man who wrote a couple of decades later, or 1 decade later, a little bit later, Geography Eichhorn. And he gave an impetus to this idea of an Ur-Gospel, and at the same time he also killed off the hypothesis. And you will see immediately why. This was what he did in his first book, and this is where he ended 25 years later. Yeah? He starts with his Ur-Evangelium. Yeah, oral tradition, that's somewhere there, but it does not need to put that on the table. He says, we don't know anything of this, so we leave this out. We have an Ur-Evangelium. We have 3 Gospels, yeah, but these Gospels, they have been developed in different ways. There is levels in between. There's even a second level at a certain point. And so what he does, he has this Ur-Evangelium being developed with lots of hypothetical documents or sources. We don't have anything of this A, B, C, D. The only thing we have is a Matthew, a Mark, and a Luke Gospel. Yeah? And he even goes so far as to say, well, Matthew was actually developed in 2 ways. In an Aramaic form, which is rather pure, but then also in a Greek translation that is what we have today. Yeah? You see immediately the problem with such an hypothesis. It sounds simple. There's one thing at the top, and then it peters out into 3 Gospels. Once you go into the details, which Mr. Eichhorn did, it turns out that it's very difficult to work with this simple thing. And you see it here. That's where he ended in 1820. He has a gospel. He has an entity, hypothetical, for everything. So he works actually. He ends up working in an almost mechanical way. I have something in Luke that I cannot derive from Matthew, also not from Mark. So it must be in F. It comes from F. Yeah, but he also has this thing there in C, that looks quite the same. So maybe we should then have a B, where this was identical and then developed into 2 similar things, but not completely identical things, and then ended up in another form. You can go on adding to this as much as you like. This is a false friend solution. Yeah? You just draw a nice drawing, but this does not explain anything. it does not explain. Because you just work mechanically. Anything that I cannot understand, I put it somewhere higher up. Because you will see here, you will see it there, you will see it there. There is no direct link between the three Synoptic Gospels as we have them. It's all put up somewhere there where we can't reach it anymore. This is actually a false solution. Yeah? If I say, well, I see that you and I have something in common, but I'm not prepared to say that you copied me or that I copy you. Well, I put it somewhere in the air there. That's where it all started. That's easy, but you cannot prove such a thing, in a sense. Okay, that's more than enough on this. Another way of looking at it, and you may have heard of that, is this fragmented hypothesis, or the Egesa hypothesis, with a number of people again, among them Schleiermacher. They work with the idea that there is, again, no direct link, but there is tradition, and at the origin, not just oral tradition, but bits and pieces of written texts. Yeah? There was a collection of miracles of Jesus, a collection of discourses of Jesus, a narrative on the infancy of Jesus, and these things, they circulated independently. At one point, they were put together, and then other material was added to that, and it all ends in the three Gospels as we have it. Again, with no links between the three, or no direct links between the three. It all is, so it's basically the same critique. It's all put somewhere in the air, up there. It all happened, all the interesting things actually happened where we can't see them anymore. Yeah, they are up there somewhere. Yeah. Again, there's an easy solution. A third way of looking at it is a variant on the other one, is the tradition hypothesis, with again a good number of important people. Herder is there, De Wette is there. Yeah, they give again a big a big place to oral tradition. Yeah, so no corpuscula of written fragments or anything like that. It's oral tradition, oral tradition, oral tradition. It can be in Aramaic, it can be in Greek, and then in the end we start coming down to the Gospels. And here, for the first time, we see that there are links, tentative links if you want, but some links between the three synoptic, or at least 2 or 3 synoptic Gospels. Yeah? So Matthew has been an influence on Luke, according to the hypothesis of Herder. There is a kind of Schrift of Mark, so a text of Mark, that ended up in our Gospel, but that was also of influence on Luke, along with this revised version of Mark. Yeah? But so here you see for the first time, and also in the variant, which is much simpler, by De Wette, you see for the first time that there are direct links created between our 3 Gospels. Yeah? Mark here is influenced, or knows the Gospel of Matthew, knows the Gospel of Luke. Yeah? Here it's the other way around. But this is the first time, so we are now at the very end of the 18th and the beginning of the 19th century. This is what came. This is brilliant, because at least it recognizes the problem and comes up with a solution, but this solution has not been argued in detail. Herder does not have the time to write all the details of these things. He gives the framework for that. Yeah? Another problem is that it's a good idea to have a hypothesis. The worst that can happen is that the wrong people start using your hypothesis. Yeah? And this has been the case here. David Friedrich Strauss picked up on this hypothesis, wrote his Leben Jesu, which was like an insult to the academic world and to the ecclesial world of his time. And he was criticized by the whole world on that, which meant he went down and he took the hypothesis with him. No one wanted to be identified with this hypothesis because Strauss was the guy who used this hypothesis, and I don't want to identify with Mr. Strauss because he's been expelled from the church. and so you see this this fate of, and we will see other examples, this fate of the hypothesis. You can have a brilliant idea, and then the wrong people start using your idea, and your idea goes down because of these guys who have used your hypothesis, in a sense. Yeah, that's what happened with Mr. Strauss. Is this? Yeah, and leave it here for now. Is this clear? Can we go on, or do you have any questions on this? Because as you have seen, up to now, with the last exception, there is no link yet between the three synoptic gospels. And where they made the link, there is still this ballast, this enormous amount of things that happened there in the air before we come to the real links, actually.
Just small technical question. Can you see it? It's not a problem with the sun. Is it okay?
It's okay, yeah.
It's visible.
Then we enter, if you want, a new stage, or at least a new approach. It's not always chronological, so yeah, this is, in a sense, already prepared for by some people, but they always remain, let's say, marginal. Yeah. But what you see happen is that people go back or try to understand the Gospels, or the links between the Gospels, on the basis of direct literary dependence, not somewhere in the air, something, but direct literary dependence. So you have different ways to do that. When you have 3 Gospels, I've put them there, yeah, you have all possible things. You can say that A was first, B used A, and C used B. Or you put ACB, or you put A as the common denominator of B and C, or you put it like this, or you put it like that, or you put it like that. You can put it like this again. Yeah. So you have all possible. I can assure you, all of them have been proposed and tried out by someone in the 19th century. So you will not find anything new in that. So I can give you names for all of this. I give you a couple of them. You have people who argued for the priority of Luke. So putting Luke first. You have people who have argued for the priority of Matthew, which is actually the old hypothesis of Augustine, with Grotius in 1641 took up with one variant. Augustine had said each of the 3, and in a canonical order, knows his predecessor or predecessors. So Mark knows Matthew, Luke knows the 2 others. Yeah? But the variant in Grotius is that he gets away from Augustine's disqualification of Mark. Augustine had said Mark is an abbreviator only of Matthew. And by disqualification, he already disqualified Mark's Gospel as, well, you can leave it out, there's nothing in there, it's just an abbreviation of Matthew. Grotius corrects Augustine in this one and says, no, Mark is shorter, that's for sure, so he has shortened, but it is a Gospel in its own right, and there was good reasons why Mark left out certain parts of Matthew. It's not shortening just because he did not have enough place or pages available. He had a purpose for that. That's what Grotius, in the way that Grotius changes Augustine's. And then you have a third, in this period, a third thing, and that is to put Matthew last. Yeah? So Matthew comes in here as a middle term, there in this hypothesis, with Owen, Stroud, and then above all with G.G. Griesbach. Matthew is put last. Yeah? And for Griesbach, who was actually a textual critic, that's him, this is based on very detailed observations, on very clear, pointed observations. That's the brilliance of Griesbach, but also the weakness of the hypothesis, because the hypothesis that he defends, in which Mark is last, knows the 2 others, and has then, in one way or another, conflated the two. That's what the word he uses. Mark conflates elements from Matthew and from Luke in his gospel. He shortens them, yeah, but he conflates them also at certain points. For the shortening, Griesbach does not have much of an argument. He just says, well, that's what it is. It's shorter than the others. So he must have shortened because he knows the two others. One reason could be that he found, that's what Griesbach says, that Mark found it too difficult to conflate the two. Or that he found that basically they say the same, there was no reason to conflate them. Which means that Mark's conflation often comes down to details, actually. And a typical case is Mark 1:32. If you take your, if you have a New Testament with you, synopsis is better, but you will see that in Mark 1:32, this is a prototypical case. Yeah. It says, when evening came and the sun went down. Yeah? When evening came and the sun went down, then people brought the ill to Jesus. Because, now in Matthew, you find when evening came, and in Luke, when the sun went down. Yeah? So Matthew has one element, and Luke has another element, and actually they are synonymous, we'd say. Yeah? When evening comes, usually the sun goes down in the evening. Yeah? And Mark has the two. When evening came, the sun went down. This has often been taken as a typical way of conflating. He has Matthew, he has Luke, and then he says, oh, that's nice, I put them together. And this has often been interpreted as nonsensical or redundant at best, redundant, because it just repeats itself. And this is often then taken as an indication that Mark's Greek is less good than Matthew's and Luke's Greek. Yeah? This is one way to look at it. I defend a different opinion, and we've worked hard on that in Leuven, together with my predecessor, my former boss. It depends on how you read it. You can read when evening came and the sun went down as a redundant thing, or you can take the second part as a specification of the first. Yeah? When evening comes, well, when starts evening? In Roman times, it starts from 3 o'clock in the afternoon. In Spain today, afternoon, you can already say buenas tardes, good evening. So at 1 o'clock, you can already say good evening to some people. To people when you meet them. So it depends when evening starts. Now, evening can start early, depending on the season as well. That can start at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. The sun is not really going down yet. Well, a little bit, but you don't see that. So you can take this second thing as a specification. It's in the evening when you really see the sun going down. So he specifies this broad idea when evening comes. Then it's not redundancy. It's just a way of over-specification, if you want. That's up for you to decide whether you like this, but that's a way to handle that. In any case, Mr. Griesbach and his hypothesis has been quite influential later on, all through the 19th century and later. Again, there is a problem, the same problem as with our friend Verheyden. It's in part the wrong people who pick up on your hypothesis. Yeah. In this case, it was not that dramatic as with Verheyden, but Griesbach's hypothesis was picked up by Bauer to do something that Griesbach never intended to do. Griesbach was a textual critic. He explains various readings and combinations of readings, and that's it. He does not do theology. Yeah? And then he gets a guy like Ferdinand Christian Bauer, who is larger than life. He was a monument, who uses this hypothesis to write on the canonical Gospels, their relation to each other, their character and their origin, a very influential book, in which he interprets the relations between the Gospels not on the basis of literary dependence or so, but that's behind a bit, but in the back, that's not his interest, but on the basis of a presupposition or general theory he has on the development of Christianity. And this theory is very much informed or influenced by the dialectics of Hegel. So when you have what was it? Matthew? Yeah, it's gone.
You have to take your pen.
Yeah, the pen.
Over there, on the board.
Yeah. You have Matthew. Yeah.
Sorry.
This is going wrong.
Or maybe you can just use this one.
Yeah, I can go there. Yeah.
Whiteboard, yeah.
So you have Matthew, you have Luke, and you have Mark. First of all, this our friend Griesbach never did. He never spoke out on the relation between these two. He spoke out on the relation between these two. What does Bauer do? He puts this model, he puts on this model the model of Hegel's dialectics. And what do you get? You get Jewish Christian church, and you get a church from the Gentiles here. And they are, of course, in contrast with each other, in opposition. And then you have the synthesis here. So, he turns the whole thing of Griesbach in something completely...
That there is the eraser.
Oh, yeah. He puts the whole theory of Griesbach to use for something completely different. Yeah? He has this nice model, very Hegelian. There is an A and there is a B, they are contrastes, and there is C that brings the synthesis. The strange thing and the ironic thing is that Griesbach wants to make him a mere conflator, a second hand in a sense. In Bauer's hands, he ends up to be the synthesis, which means the ultimate, the best in a sense. The one who brings it all to a climax. And without the intention of Bauer did not want to do that, of course, he has actually planted the seed for market priority there. If that's the synthesis, then maybe we just should drop this whole Hegelian thing and take him as the best and the others as developments from the best. That's the reasoning that a lot of people have done then. They did not want to be Hegelian, they did not like dialectics, they just went their own way. This was already tried in one way or another by a guy who wrote some years, or several decades earlier, Gottlob Storr, De Fotum Evangelium Matthäus Lucae, who comes up with this model. And Mark is first there. So he does this before Bauer. But after Bauer, people have picked up on this with this idea. Okay? This is the synthesis, so this is the best, so this is the first. And the others are derivative gospels. He has put this like that. And you see now there's full evidence for market priority, but also for direct links between the gospels. There's no all kinds of things in the air, except that there is some material in Luke and some material in Matthew that does not have a parallel in either of the other gospels. So they come from somewhere, that's here. And for Matthew, he still lives with a theory from the past that goes back to the 2nd century, It's this weird idea of a certain Papias, who in the beginning of the 2nd century has defended the proposal with no illustrations, with no examples and no arguments, that Matthew originally was written in what he calls the Hebrew dialect, what people then took for Aramaic. So there must be a place somewhere for an Aramaic gospel, which means in this model, and that's the weakness of the model, there is a Greek gospel that one guy at one point has doubled in size, but also translated in Aramaic, only to find out that this is actually a waste of time. Another one then translated, or the same one, that is not clear, translated it then in Greek, because that's the language that people read. Yeah? No one reads is Aramaic. So there is this detour, which is actually a leftover of this old hypothesis by Papias, of which we have only fragments. In any case, we have here the start of with the Markan priority. This gets full interest then in the third decade of the 19th century, with two people, especially. It's Mr. Weisse and Mr. Wilke, yeah, who wrote books in which they defend this model. Mark is first, Luke and Matthew come later. Yeah? Wilke does it with a slightly different way than Weisse. So I put here Wilke's position. Mark first, Luke second, and Matthew is the third, and he does the two others. What is behind and above that is of no importance. We can't see that. We don't go into that. Wilke says there must be something before, at least oral tradition. Yeah? But we don't speak about that. We talk about the Gospels as we have them. That's the attitude. Yeah? Pfeiffer does the same in line with Wilke, but he changes these and puts Luke last. Yeah? Wilke himself and Weisse as well have come back, especially Weisse, have come back from this hypothesis. At one point, this was what they originally presented, and Weisse as well. No, it can't be true. We cannot say that, we cannot say anything about what was before Mark. And this is almost natural in a sense. Yeah? You want to go closer to the origin, or whatever you consider to be the origin. That's what they do. And so what do? They bring in, again, what already existed with Lessing, an Ur-Gospel. With the variation here, it's not an Ur-Gospel, of which all the three independently depend. It's an Ur-Mark, an earlier version of Mark, which is the source of the tree, either in its simple form, the three are not linked directly to each other, or in more complex form, in which the three all go back to the Ur, but also have links amongst each other. So there is a kind of pseudo-Markan priority, if you want, on a level that is a bit complicated, and certainly more complicated than there. But it's this old idea: is it really not possible to go beyond Mark? Yes, it is possible, and it helps us explain a lot of material in Matthew and Luke that we don't have in Mark. Because this Ur-Mark has everything that we have in Mark, plus a lot more, which is what we find in the two others. Basically, you have not solved anything, because you have just put everything in something that you don't know, that you don't want to reconstruct either, and that explains all the rest. So it's an easy way, in a sense. Yeah. And you can do the same with variations. Yeah? This one has been defended very, very fanatically, I could say, by an Austrian colleague in the last 25 years of last century, so not in the 19th, but 20th century. It's Mark and priority, yeah. But Matthew and Luke do not depend on our canonical gospel. They depend on a rewritten version of Mark. And all the agreements between these two can be explained from their dependence on this revised version of Mark. Now the problem is, and this happens in history, of course, things get lost. In this case, the wrong thing got lost. We have this first draft of Mark, which we made our canonical Mark, and sadly, this revised, much longer, much more interesting form of Mark was lost, except for traces that we have in Luke and in Matthew. That's the hypothesis of Albert Fuchs. Yeah? So, it depends what you want to prove with this. And you see in Fuchs a development there, which is influenced by the idea we should keep it simple. Yeah? Well, he tried to keep it simple, but he complicated things. Because he first devised this model to explain small agreements between Matthew and Luke against Mark. And this revision was actually just a bit polishing the text, make it a little bit nicer, left and right, little word change left, a little word change right. And that explains why there is at certain points small agreements between the two, but they come from this, but this unfortunately was lost to us. In the second book, he got that's a difficulty that many scholars have, not just in synoptic studies, you can get induced by your own hypothesis. You're so impressed by your own genius that you say, my hypothesis can explain everything. So I go one step further. And he said, well, there is not just small agreements between Matthew and Luke that I can explain through this small revision of canonical Mark, but there are also major agreements between Matthew and Luke against Mark, and I also put that in my Deuteromark. So his Deuteromark moved from let's say a bit polished version of canonical Mark to a Mark that explodes and triples in size. Yeah. And that was lost to us, but Matthew and Luke fortunately saved traces of that, which is the material where they agree, the double tradition material where they agree. So you see how a scholar can get deluded by his own genius in a sense. And, that also happens. I'm almost there, you know, I'm already in the 20th century now. I should say one thing maybe on the battle, as I call it, for the two source hypothesis, because until now I've been talking about Mark, but as you probably know, the leading hypothesis today and for a while is an hypothesis in which you have this one, huh? In which you have two sources. In which you have two sources. You have canonical Mark, you have a hypothetical source, which is called Q here, I'll come to that. You have Matthew, you have Luke, and these two have used both these sources. They have used Mark and they have used Q independently. That's the two-source hypothesis. That's the basic source. The basic hypothesis, majority of scholars still believe in this. And how did we get there? We get there through this Mr. Weisse, who has the benefit of, or the merit of having defended Mark in priority, but then also postulated a source which he called a collection of sayings that explains lots of material in Matthew and in Luke that are not in Mark, and then of course some extra material that comes from another document that is in Luke and in Matthew. But this is the real new thing, starting in 1838 with this Mr. Weisse, which is the the start of the two-source hypothesis. Yeah? There is a mark. And the problem with the source, with the solution from the start has been that we introduce a hypothetical source. Weiss's comment on that was, yeah, but we've been living with an ur-gospel for so long. If others can invent an hypothetical ur-gospel, I'm entitled to invent an hypothetical collection of sayings to explain the evidence. It's a good argument, it's a good point. Yeah? But then we see the same happen here with what happened with the marking priority in a sense. Yeah? People are impressed by this, but still this marking priority thing has to be nuanced for many. That is what was done most forcefully by Heinrich Julius Holtzmann in his Synoptic Evangelium, yeah, where he says, marker priority, okay, but not our mark. It must be a proto-mark, an ur-mark. We can't give up on this. Yeah? So he ends up with two hypothetical sources, a gospel which he calls A, which was the earlier version of our canonical mark, and a text which he calls lambda, the Greek L, which is this sayings collection there. And that is already close to what I have there. Yeah? You have this, and this, and this, and this, and then some extra material there. Yeah? It took him, how long is it? 20 years, Mr. Holtzmann, and the help of a brilliant student of him, Edward Simmons, yeah, to get convinced that this is ballast, that we don't need this, that this complicates the whole thing. And so 22 years after he had written his Synoptic Evangelium, in his Lehrbuch of 1885, he finally ends where I am. Mark's Gospel, our canonical mark, a sayings collection, which he calls lambda there, and we call it Q, I call it that, Matthew's Gospel and Luke's Gospel, yeah, with one problem still. He still believes that there is a link between Matthew and Luke here. Yeah? This is not there in my model. Yeah? We have to wait for Wernley in 1899, Paul Wernley, it's just a small book, 100 pages, not more, who gets rid of this. So no link here. With the very simple argument, which is a general argument, in a sense, which has been criticized, but I still am convinced, you don't propose solutions that solve 20% of the problem and create 80% more problems. That's not a solution, that's a complication. By drawing a line here, you solve a number of problems, yeah, and you create more problems. If you have a line here, you can explain certain agreements between Matthew and Luke. Yeah, Luke follows Matthew, and as it is here, Luke follows Matthew, and yeah, so he's influenced by Matthew every now and then. That explains certain agreements between the two. But then you come to, let's say, the Sermon on the Mount, and you have Luke knowing Matthew's sermon and just ignoring it and going his own way. So you have maybe solved problems on little details where they agree, and you have created more problems because how to explain that Luke knows Matthew's Gospel on the Mount, and then there's something completely different with the sermon, with this verse of the sermon. So in the interest of being economical, in a sense, when they said, don't draw lines where you create more problems than that you solve problems. And I still think that this is quite a good observation. This creates more problems, so stay away from drawing lines here. I come to that in a moment. That's where we are. Yeah? That's the end of the 19th century, and that's the end of an era as well. in 1901, there is a couple of books published that just make tabula rasa with everything that was written in the 19th century. It's first William Verheyden's Das Messiasgeheimnis, and second Albert Schweitzer's Das Leben Jesu. Yeah? The 19th century can be summarized in 2 words, if you want. It's an obsession with sources, and we need sources, Proto, Matthew, Mark, and Ur, Mark, and we need sources, and the Gospels are written by historians who tell us the life of Jesus. Yeah? They are, yeah, Verheyden, das Messias, not das Markusgeheimnis, das Messiasgeheimnis. Yeah? Sorry there.
Messianic secret.
Yes, this Messianic secret, this Messianic secret. He says, the evangelists are everything except historians. They don't write the life of Jesus. So all these hundreds of lives of Jesus that we have in the 19th century, there's nothing that you can get from there. Yeah, it's not worth of it. And what you get there is theology. These are authors, are theologians. They have theological purposes. And the key purpose, according to Verheyden, in the Gospel of Mark, is that we get in the Gospel of Mark, through narrative and through discourse, gradually we get introduced into who Jesus is. He is the Messiah. And this is put in a narrative context, but that's just a choice. You could have done it differently. This is put in a narrative context, which has certain advantages, of course, but this was never meant to be anything like a life of Jesus. It's about the identity of Jesus. This is really nicely said by someone I like very much, Julius Wellhausen. In his Einleitung in die drei Ersten Evangelien of 1905, he says, the Gospels is die Botschaft von Jesu Christu. It's not the message of Jesus, in the sense that Jesus brings us a message. It's the message on Jesus. Yeah? How Jesus is to be understood. Who he was, what he brought. Yeah? This is no less than a revolution. Yeah? And the same with Schweitzer, yeah? Where his Geschichte der Leben Jesu Forschung, he surveys everyone, and in the end he just says, this is a waste of time. All these lives of Jesus, they are fanciful. They are a kind of 19th century gospel harmonizing thing, but they are not what Gospels are about. Gospels are about theology. So this is like the end of an era that is there. The two-source hypothesis survived this, but was put on hold for a while. People were actually fed up with source criticism, with the whole thing of looking to all relations. And so what did they do? They just left it there. They went to do some different things. They developed in the first decade of the 20th century the Religionsgeschichtliche Schule, so the religion historical approach. They developed afterwards form criticism, and then came redaction criticism, and with redaction criticism we again get, but then we are in the 1940s already, we get again an interest in the synoptic problem. Yeah. Now, what are the real problems with the two-source hypothesis? The problems are everywhere. I put 2 of them, actually there's 3 if you want. Yeah. With regard to Markan priority, is the first problem is Matthew and Luke have like about 1,000 cases where they agree on small things together against Mark. In material where they are clearly, according to the hypothesis, following Mark. So Mark is their source, they do their own thing with it, but then on a number of cases they choose to change Mark in exactly the same way. And I refuse to draw a line here, yeah? that creates a huge problem. Yeah? That is problem of the minor agreements, so the small agreements. There's a little book here, there's a bigger book that I did not bring with me, where you have the full list of the 1,000+ agreements between Matthew and Luke on details, if you want. Some are not on details, and they are a really huge problem for the hypothesis. I follow this hypothesis, and I fully part of my life is dedicated in trying to explain this whole thing. I already mentioned here the types of explanation. How can you deal with them? There are a number of ways to deal with them. First principle, you cannot explain all these small agreements with the same argument, on the same way. They are of different quality, so there is different options, different possible explanations. A good deal of them can be explained on the basis of language, stylistic. Mark wrote in a certain way, and Matthew and Luke have changed that because it sounds better. Yeah? A number of them can be explained like that. A number are probably text critical. We have an agreement between Matthew and Luke because Mr. Haaland has given us a text in which they agree. Yeah? You may be sure for a good number of these small agreements, when you look in the small text, in the critical apparatus, you find variants in either Matthew or in Luke, where the agreement disappears, where there is no agreement anymore. So it depends on the solution taken by Mr. Haaland here, in the edition that we use, that creates an agreement that was maybe never there in the original text. Yeah? Tradition critical, Matthew and Luke, and that is important nuance, if you want, on this. Matthew and Luke do not just have Mark and Q, they have, of course, their own tradition. Not in the form of written text, maybe, but oral tradition. Oral tradition did not stop when Mark's Gospel was written. It went on, of course. And so they have their own traditions, they have stuff of their own, material of their own, written or not written, which may have influenced their formulation at a certain point and coincident maybe in the same way. And the fourth model of explanation is liturgical. Certain texts were of course used in liturgy, and liturgical use may have influenced the formulation of a text in the Matthean community in the same way as it is in the Lucan community, without the two knowing each other of necessity. So these are models to do so. You can adapt the model, but then we are again in the same problem. You could say, well, it has been done by an American scholar, Robert Gundry. There is a line here, but the line is not of the same quality as this line or any of these four lines here. There is a kind of this line, if you want, a pointed line. And when Luke was writing his gospel, he had access to Mark, to Q, yeah? And at one point, he stumbled on a copy of Matthew. His gospel was almost ready, but hello, nice, there's something else. I'll have a look in that third gospel. And then he says, well, he says this better than I have it. And I copy Mark here. He says it better. I'm going to change my text a bit. And so you end up with 1,000 little changes he made to his gospel after he got access to this. The problem is actually the same as when you draw a full line there, whether this is this or how do you know that Luke only looked at these little details and just ignored the big differences there are between him, and you have to explain that. So again, it's better not to have any line there. The problem with Q is huge, maybe the same amount as the other one. First of all, is the idea, can you accept hypothetical sources? I think for me it's a given. I don't argue that. There's no science in which you don't use hypothetical entities. Yeah? Do it all the time in any other science, even in the hard sciences. Yeah? And the black hole, no one has got to see a black hole. You don't encounter it here on the corridor, but it's there in the discourse, in the scientific discourse. Yeah? It explains phenomena that we can see. This is what I would call Q. Q explains phenomena in Matthew and in Luke. That means huge parts of text where they are very close or even verbatim agreement with each other that are not in Mark. So one way to explain that is put it in this collection of sayings. It's almost for 95% sayings material, Jesus speaking. Yeah? So this is one way. A problem is this hypothetical thing. Another problem is, what do you put in this queue? Yeah, as I said, it's material where Matthew and Luke agree on larger stuff, sayings material, against Mark, and which is not in Mark. It is not in Mark. So it must come from somewhere else. Problem is, how do you define material where they agree? Does that mean 100% agreement? 50% agreement? Does that still count? 40% agreement? My principle is, and I can argue for that, it is all the material that is double attested, so where we have attestation in Matthew and in Luke, be it for 100% or for a 30% agreement, but all of that material and only such material. So don't smuggle in material where Luke has something and Matthew does not have it, and you say, yeah, but it also sounds very nice, it's Jesus who speaks, so maybe it also comes from Q. Then you destroy the hypothesis. You have to just know your limits with your hypothesis. It's better to have a limited, but a sound, consistent hypothesis than to open up doors that you cannot close anymore afterwards. So my principle is, in Q, you put only material that is doubly attested from 100 to 30%, and that is and only such material. No material that is only attested in one or two, but not in others. Now, some scholars have tried to do that, and it failed, because when you open the door for material that is only in Luke, there is as much material only in Matthew that also is entitled to enter Q then. Yeah? I'm afraid. It does not solve anything, it just moves up the problem to there, because then you have to explain why Matthew took this and Luke did not take, and Luke took something else that the other one didn't take. Yeah? You just put it on a level there and you have to explain. The problem with the hypothesis as I have it is, of course, that you have to explain where the differences come from then. When it's 100% agreement, the problem is solved. They just take it from the same source verbatim. There's only a few such cases, unfortunately. There is a lot of cases where it's down to 70 and even to 50%. Yeah? And these are the really difficult cases for the hypothesis. Yeah? But that is where, in my opinion then, redaction criticism come in. I believe that, and that this goes back to my friend Verheyden and others, I believe that the gospel writers are authors and theologians. They have a religious message to bring. They know what they want to say, and they can say it in their own way. They are inspired by others, influenced by others, but they are not bound to the others. These are not gospels in the sense that they are law or so. These are books, writings that have a certain, let's say, authority, but not yet sacred scripture or anything like that at the time that these two are writing. So they take their liberty in using their sources, which is what every author does. Yeah? And that can explain, but it's a very painful work, a long work to do, can explain certain amounts of differences. But we'll say something more on that tomorrow between the two. Yeah? I have like 20 minutes. Are there any questions on this? No? and I just go on here, a problem that I guess is solved today, but was longer too. Yeah, this is a sayings collection. And this is a narrative text. And these are narrative texts with sayings material in it. There is no such thing like a sayings collection in antiquity. We don't have any other model that has been used as an argument against Q. You create something that we don't have, and that does not look like anything that we know in antiquity. There is no sayings collection. Yeah, this is plain wrong, of course. This is plain wrong. We do have in antiquity sayings collections, not just in Jewish world, not just in Christianity, the Gospel of Thomas, and not just in these two, but also in pagan world. We have sayings collections. Plutarch has written 150 pages sayings collection with hardly any narrative context. Yeah? So we have this as a model, as a genre, it exists. Yeah? So if it exists, Q is not an exception to anything. A real problem is, of course, the next two ones, an arrangement of the material. Arranging the material, yeah, when we look to it tomorrow, you will see that these agreements on material that is not in Mark, sayings material is not in Mark, that it comes up in Mark, in Matthew and in Luke at different places, which creates a huge problem. Where and how was it arranged in Q? Yeah? Was it this order? Was it that order? Or have both changed the order? And do we have an order that we have to reconstruct, hypothetically, for Q? That's a huge problem. Again, there has been work on that. Then the real problem is not just in praxis, but also in theory. Can you pose the existence of a hypothetical source, or a hypothetical source, and then say, but I don't want to reconstruct it. It's there to explain certain phenomena here, but I don't want to know how it looked like. That's too far. That was the big debate between my supervisor and myself. We always backed off in trying to reconstruct Q. You just say, well, that looks the same, more or less. This comes from there. But how it looked there, we don't say anything about that. We can't do that. I have worked, not just for myself, but as part of a team, in reconstructing Q. The principle that, as a scholar, you just have to do that. It's your duty. Again, with my black hole, if you want, people have posited this idea of a black hole, but then they have not said, well, we cannot say anything about that. No, that's wrong. A scholar should try to say something about that. Maybe very little, maybe very, very hypothetically, but you have to say something. It's too easy to say, well, we put it in the bag there, but don't open the bag. I don't know what is in it, actually. That's wrong, I think. You have to do and have to make an effort to reconstruct this common source, of course, with all potential mistakes that you can make, and with lots of reservation about what is really possible in that. And the last thing, or a couple of things, but less important, one way to solve the problem of differences is, well, let's make not just Q, but do it like this. You have Mark, you have Q, you have a QL, and you have a QM. Yeah, this is Matthew, this is Luke. This is Matthew, this is Luke. They both know Mark, but then they had their own version of Q. So Q had been copied, and of course some mistakes or some changes were made. And Matthew has a Q that looks very much like his wording is, and Luke has one that looks like his wording is. Again, this is a false solution, or a false friend solution, if you want. You put the problems you have on this level, here, and you solve it just with one strike. I put it there. I don't know how it looks like, of course, but it looks like this. Yeah? This is not really logical then. Yeah? If you don't know how it looks like, you are not entitled to say, well, it looks like this. Yeah? So you create an intermediate level that explains everything just like that. It's an easy way, but it is a way, and that's my basic argument for this and for all the rest actually. And if you take as your axioma that the gospel authors are authors and theologians who have a message of their own to bring, you have to respect this. An author means, by definition, someone who has the freedom to do what he wants to do, or what she wants to do. It's not a scribe, it's not someone who copies things, it's someone who makes something new on the basis of old stuff. Yeah? If you take this seriously, and I think that's what you should do, then you have for yourself the duty to explain differences, not by put it there somewhere and then keep it out of your problems. Just try to explain where these differences come from. Yeah? On the basis of this principle that these are authors and have the freedom to do their own thing. The explanation that you come up with is, of course, something that should be consistent. Yeah? Your author must have a certain consistency. You cannot say that Luke on page 1 defended this, and on page 2 defended the opposite. Then there is something wrong with Luke, maybe, but especially with yourself, because your author must be, in principle, consistent, unless you find real proof that he is inconsistent by definition or by exception. So if you give your idea of an author as someone who has a purpose, who has a mission, who has the freedom to work and a consistency in presenting his message, then you have to come up with explanations that make this a consistent entity, this author. That's the problem, but that's also what you have to accept, I would say. And then the original language that has been discussed, some people have tried, it's this old thing again. We go beyond the Gospels, because this is beyond the Gospels, so it must be Aramaic. The old thing, Matthew was Aramaic first before it became Greek. So some people have tried to defend Q is Aramaic. Yeah? No one does it today anymore, but some have tried at least. The tradition and convulsion history, that's a bit more difficult. There's the question, how is this collection put together? Is this completely randomly with all kinds of sayings that are just mixed up? I don't think this is the case. There is certain patterns to be found, associative patterns, but also other patterns. Again, the question is then, how does this come together? You have wisdom sections in this sayings material. You have more apocalyptic sections in this text. How do they come together? Were they composed in different times and then put together? Were they composed together? That's a very big problem, of course, to discuss. Date and providence, that is less important. More important is, and very, very much debated, is we have a number of texts, 28, according to some scholars, where Mark and Q seem to have a passage that is similar. Not identical, but similar. 28 is maybe the extreme. I tend to go a bit less, but at least there's more than one and two, which can explain some of the material that is part of the explanation there, but something special, that it can explain some of the agreements here, where there is cases where they have a certain story or wording in Mark, and a certain wording in Q that looks very similar, then Mark and Q may have had this same logium, this same saying of Jesus, with slight difference maybe, or identical, whatever, and they have two sources to look at and to be inspired from. Yeah? Some people have tried to draw a line here again, yeah? Either in this way or in that way. Yeah? That is again the same principle that Verheyden had. This creates more problems than it solves, so we don't draw lines there, because it does not help us in any way. If you draw a line here, let's say that Mark also influenced Q, then your Q has to be explained as something in which all the narrative material in Mark, and that's the majority of the material, is disappeared. Yeah? When you go this way, and then on top of that, that Q then picks material from Mark very selectively. He has 28, let's say, sayings that are in Mark, and many other sayings in Mark are apparently irrelevant for this collector of sayings, which is strange. And the other way around, it's even stranger, because Mark would then not be the prior gospel, it would be the one who depends on Q, yeah, and then becomes secondary only to the others. But if Mark already knows Q and picks out very selectively there, why would people like Matthew and Luke still bother much about Mark? They could just go to Q maybe and keep it there. So that's another problem, but sure I can solve it if you want. I leave this out and I end with just saying 2 words, if I am allowed, about where we are today. Everything that has been said before is back on the table today. As I said a moment ago, in 1900 people were fed up with this source criticism. The 2 source hypotheses won the day, Mark and Q, and the other 2 are depending, so Wernerley, Holtzmann, they had won the day. People went to do other things, like religion historical questions, like form criticism, then redaction criticism, it comes back on the table, but in the wrong way again, which means no one really discussed the hypothesis. The hypothesis was taken for granted. So, the only thing worse than being rejected is that no one really cares about the hypothesis anymore. That is worse, because everyone said, okay, Mark is first and Q is the other one, and it's solved. We just work like that. A couple of people have disagreed with that and have tried to revive alternatives. One alternative started in the 30s, 1930s already, in England, and these people brought back the old Augustinian hypothesis. Matthew's first, Mark's second, and Luke knows the 2 others. It has certain advantages, simplicity first, but the simplicity is also a disadvantage because they thought that Matthew is responsible for everything in the gospel, and where it comes from we don't care. And Mark has then to be explained as someone who just is very selective in reading out all the interesting stuff in Matthew. He does not seem to care about the Sermon on the Mount apparently, so he reads it in Matthew, so doesn't matter, we drop it, yeah? Which is strange, I would say. Another hypothesis is that had an origin, started in the mid-60s with William Farmer, an American. He went back all the way to Griesbach. Matthew's first is Luke, and Mark is a mere conflator. He was very vocal, very active, I will say something on that tomorrow, defended that till the end of his days, and had a lot of personal sacrifice to defend that, as I will tell you tomorrow. That's something that was back on the table. Today, this is almost gone. No one, but again, don't trust that. Never in these synoptic studies and in other studies, there's nothing that goes away forever. It's dead for now. It will be revived in 20 years by someone who picks up on that again, I'm sure. Yeah, I'm sure. Another hypothesis, and that is new in a sense, though not completely. It's the, where is my, I ate it, I forgot it, I lost it. So you had the classic one, Mark, Q, Matthew, Luke. And then you have the one, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. That's Augustine. Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So Augustine, Then you have the Griesbach, there is Matthew, there is Luke, and there is Mark at the end. Except that for Farmer, Matthew and Luke also are linked. So Matthew becomes then the first one. Matthew is the first, Luke, and Mark, those are the two others. And then that's the Griesbach, but with a twist. And then there's the really new one, if you want, or at least a bit newer than the others. That's Mark first, Matthew, Luke, both know Mark, so Mark and priority in a very strict sense, but without Q, because all this material that I put in Q, they put it in Matthew. Yeah? That's the hypothesis by a British theologian in the 50s, which is called Farrer, Mr. Farrer, and he had written one article in which he suggested that, and then did all kinds of strange things, but this was the basis, and he was a person with a lot of charisma. And so he influenced a British exegete, Michael Golder, and influenced really in a sense like veneration. So Farmer has the truth, and whatever Farmer says or whatever is the truth by definition. Golder was much cleverer than Farmer ever was, but he had this veneration for the master, and he really developed that into an alternative hypothesis. Golder had a student, had only one, Mark Goodacre, who then picked up on Golder, but like all good students, he did not completely agree with Golder, so he also put a lot of invested a lot of energy in trying to explain that Golder left and right was not the best way to explain things. I will say something on that tomorrow, because this is a hypothesis that is, what would I say, an alternative, and maybe the only real alternative to this one. Yeah? With one important problem, as I will tell you tomorrow, Luke becomes incredibly problematic in this model. Incredibly. That is the reason why, that's the most recent development, but again, it goes back to 1830, as I showed you, and that is market priority. Yeah, so like here, no Q, but you have Luke and you have Matthew last. So instead of Matthew as a middle term and Luke last, Luke becomes a middle term and Matthew becomes last. This was defended in 1830 by Wilke, as I've shown on many of the slides there. And this has now been revived by, since 30 years, not longer, 35 years, by a small but very vocal group. They will be invited and slaughtered in December when the conference in Leuven is organized, where we will tackle their hypothesis full force. So all the whole bunch is invited, all those who are still alive. They will be invited for a conference to tackle this hypothesis. Two more things, and then I end. First, what I like about Golder in this, and what I completely dislike about Farmer in this, and about these guys in a certain sense, is that in good scientific approaches and in good scientific discourse, there is a leading hypothesis and there are alternatives. And you have to know your place. This is still, as long as it lasts, the leading hypothesis. The majority of scholars, and they are not all idiots, some are idiots and just follow it because they are too lazy to go for something else, but the majority of scholars and good people still believe that this is the best hypothesis. It explains the most of the problems with the least of complications. That's the leading hypothesis. All the others are alternatives, and they should recognize that. Golder has said that 1,000 times. I defend an alternative. It's my duty to prove the others wrong. And then my hypothesis can maybe win the day. But I have the duty to prove them wrong. This is the right attitude. And this has helped us a lot because he has done 50 years of trying to prove that this is wrong, which sharpened our knives to show that this is right, with nuancing arguments, bringing in new arguments, and so on and so on. That really helps the debate, really helps make progress. Farmer has the opposite position. He says all hypotheses are equal and they are on the same level. And I have no task and no duty to debate this one. I just present my hypothesis, and it's by definition as valuable as any other hypothesis. So I do not recognize the notion of a leading hypothesis. Yeah? The net result of that, you can do that, of course, you can say so. The net result when you do that in this topic, but also in other topics, you isolate yourself. People don't take you seriously. Yeah? Okay, you're the weirdos of the farmer school there. We don't care about them. They don't care about us. We don't care about them. In 1984, my supervisor organized together with Farmer a conference in Jerusalem, the city of peace, where they fought for 3 days, and then it was Easter, so they had to stop. Just to prove this, that there is a leading theory and there is alternatives. And as long as the alternatives cannot win the majority of scholars, they remain alternatives and not on the equal level. I don't know what you think about that. Maybe think about it and we can talk about that tomorrow, but that's quite important. That said, and then that's my inclusion if you want, but I said at the beginning, it is of course about plausibility. And we are very much aware of that. That, as I said, this is the leading hypothesis. That does not mean we have the truth. It's the leading hypothesis as long as the others cannot beat us. It's an impetus for the others to tackle this. Yeah? But this is not the truth. This is the best we can do for now, in my opinion and a couple of other people. Yeah? So we don't talk about truth claims anymore, we talk about plausibility. And the plausibility is higher here than in the others. And as long as that is the case, we have certain privileges of calling ourselves the leading hypothesis, I would say. But again, with the proviso that this may change next week. I'm going to leave it here. I'm over time. Thank you very much for listening in. Any questions can be asked tomorrow if you still are up and running tomorrow. I thank you for your presence here and for your attention.